Welcome back, Honors. Oh my gosh, you guys did a phenomenal job today in class. I was absolutely digging it. You guys were vibing really, really well. Y'all had a lot of great questions. Y'all were super interested in all the Aztec stuff, which I thought was really neat. And we left off in class talking about kind of like the Aztecs, their ability to take over large expanses of area, and just to kind of lay out who these people are again, just to make sure you understand. The Spanish, right, from Spain in England, or excuse me, oh, God, that was terrible, in Europe, are going to come over as of 1492 with Columbus, right? Columbus is then going to create a Spanish stronghold in the Caribbean islands, including places like Jamaica, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, okay? And now, upon the ascension of Hernan Cortez, or ascension slash possible murder of another member of his group, he is going to then try to create a conquest of the Aztec people in Mexico, right? And the Aztec people, also known as the Mexica Empire, as of 1519, when Cortez shows up, were very, very large, right? This entire area in yellow was controlled by the Aztec Kingdom, okay? Now, the Aztec Kingdom is very, very important because we talked about they are very advanced. They had a very extreme polytheistic structure. They had weapons made out of obsidian and like lava-based weapons, which is crazy, lava glass-based weapons. They also executed a lot of people, which we'll talk about tomorrow. We'll probably sacrifice one of you in class. And then also, they were a very extreme people, and they were led by this guy. This is the king of the Aztecs at the time. His name is Moctezuma, spelled Moctezuma. You can also spell it Montezuma. It really just depends on which version of the name you're going to use. But he is their leader, right? He is their god king. They use a theocracy in the Aztec Empire. They believe that he is an extension of their religious system, right? Now, when Cortez shows up, by the way, just to give you a heads up, the mission was supposed to be reconnaissance, all right? So just to give you a heads up, Cortez is striking out into the Mexica Empire, into the Aztec Empire, using 600 men, 16 horses, and 10 cannons, right? And he sets off on this journey, bringing only 2 boats with him, 2 ships he actually uses to go off and do this, right? Now, when they get there, a lot of people start whispering some stuff, and they're like, Yo, did you hear that Cortez wasn't even supposed to be in charge of this mission? So Cortez wasn't even supposed to be the leader of this mission. Another man was supposed to be the leader of this mission, right? The guy that was originally supposed to be in charge of the job, though, the morning of the mission, mysteriously showed up dead, right? And it appeared that he had been murdered, right? And they go out to the harbor to see if the ships are still there, and the ships are gone. That guy was the man that Cortez was passed over for that job, right? And when Cortez was gone, he took the ships, he took the men, he took the horses, and he showed up in Mexico, right? Now, when they got there, the men were like, okay, so Cortez, Hernando, this is supposed to be a reconnaissance mission, right? We're supposed to just go over here, scope them out, see what the Aztec are up to, check some things out. We got a couple of interpreters with us, and we're going to talk to them. We're going to figure out what's going on. And he literally turned and looked at them. He was like, we're not leaving without gold and conquest. And he snaps his fingers, and his soldiers, a couple of them that are loyal to him, go out into the water, and they set the ships on fire, right? The ships that brought them from Cuba to Mexico, he said, we are not leaving without our treasure, basically, right? So Cortez burned his own ships in the harbor, right? Now, the interesting thing about this as well is that you have to understand, some of you are probably like thinking about like, well, Mr. Terry, hold up, back up. How is it possible that this Spanish dude is going to talk to the Aztecs in the first place, right? We have to understand one key thing. Cortez has 2 interpreters with him, right? So why 2, you ask? Well, one of his interpreters can speak Maya and Spanish, and then the other interpreter can speak Maya and Aztec, right? So what's happening is his first interpreter, the one that knows how to speak Spanish, is actually a disgraced priest, right? A disgraced priest that was a part of some of Columbus's earliest colonies, but some of his actions ended up making him be exiled out into Mexico, and to survive, he learned how to speak Maya, because the Maya actually used to occupy this area of the Yucatan Peninsula right here, so his interpreter, he picked him up right here, okay? And he's this former Spanish priest. Well, they also, within the community that he is a part of find a woman that knows how to speak Aztec. So every time Cortez wanted to ask the Aztec anything, he would ask his interpreter would ask her, she would ask the Aztec, and the Aztec would respond to her, and then he would respond in Maya, and then he would respond in Spanish, right? So some things are going to be lost in translation, all right? So what ends up occurring is Cortez has got his 2 interpreters and all of his soldiers, and he's wandering through the dense jungle that is down in the southern area of Mexico. And he is trying to find his way to Tenochtitlan. He's trying to find the Aztec capital, and he has no idea where he's going. And they're talking to locals, and they're finding out from the locals that the locals hate the Aztec, right? They're taken over by them, and they're controlled by the Aztec, but they hate them. Why do the locals hate the Aztec? Because these are the local skulls from Aztec rituals. The people that the Aztecs sacrifice all the time are the locals that they have taken over in the past. They're almost like a taxation, right? You owe us $8 and a person for us to sacrifice. So, as he's meeting the locals and all this stuff is happening, they keep trying to tell him how to get there, but he has no idea how to get there. Moctezuma heard that they were on their way, right? Heard that they were on their way and heard that the Cortez and his men with their guns and their cannons and their horses were coming to try and take over Tenochtitlan. So what Moctezuma does is he sends him gifts, right? He sends him a set of gifts, including jaguar pelts, feathers, honey, chocolate, and like all of these other items, hoping that Cortez would take these things and go back and finish his reconnaissance mission, go back to Cuba and report on the things that he found, right? Now, Moctezuma was hoping for that, but also what was given to Cortez was a small gold idol, right? A small gold statue. And what Cortez then asked his interpreter to ask the girl, to ask the Aztec gift bearers, hey, how much more of this do you have? And then once it was translated and come back to him, the translation was a lot of it, right? And so, driven by his lust for gold, Cortez decides to follow the gift bearers back to Tenochtitlan, and he, on the way, abused the dissension within the Mexican Empire to his advantage, and he recruited an army of 6,000 natives. Now, he kept them outside of the city when he got there, right? But at this point, he leaves some of his Spanish men behind, and they stay at where the vessels would have been, where they burned them, right? And they were supposed to set up camp. And so he's got 200 Spanish, 6,000 natives, and 2 interpreters, right? And Montezuma, when they get there, right, or Montezuma, again, whatever you want to call him, whenever the Spanish get there and whenever Cortez gets there, he welcomes them with open arms, right? Moctezuma allows them to enter Tenochtitlan and wants them to come over and talk to him, right? And what ends up occurring is Cortez took him hostage when negotiations broke down, right? Because immediately what Cortez is going to do is begin to ask Moctezuma to submit to the Spanish Empire, to convert to Christianity, and to make this as easy and painless as possible for bringing his people into the Spanish Empire. Now, what ends up occurring is Moctezuma refuses to do this, right? And then under the threat of death, Cortez marches Moctezuma out onto a balcony where he was supposed to address his people and be like, allow the Spanish to come in. They are now our true leaders, blah, blah, blah. And the Aztecs look up at Moctezuma because they're sitting below a balcony waiting to find out what's going to happen now that all these natives and these Spanish and all these other people showed up. And they were sitting down there like, hey, what are we doing here? What's going on? What's up with these weirdos that showed up? We don't know them. And also, we're all really sick, and we all have this weird disease that got spots all over us and stuff. What's happening? And Moctezuma begins to address his people, and then the Aztec are like, this is not very godlike, all right? This is not very godlike. He's not connected to our religion. He is nothing. And the crowd turns on their king and start pelting rocks and stones and throwing things up at the Spanish, and they actually end up accidentally killing Moctezuma. They hit him in the head with a rock and killed him, right? And Cortez actually loses that battle. He actually gets driven out by the Aztec warriors, right? The Aztec warriors drive him out and also this small native army. But once they were gone, the damage has now been done. The Spanish, of course, brought with them the smallpox virus. The smallpox virus then runs through Tenochtitlan, and the Spanish came back with even more natives and the rest of their soldiers, the other remaining 400 soldiers, and they took over the entire city of Tenochtitlan. And not only did they take it over, but they destroyed religious idols, religious relics. They destroyed the temples. They destroyed most of the city. And I know a lot of you are like, dude, they worked really hard building those chinampas. What are you doing? I agree. I agree 100%. But Cortez then proceeded to destroy, burn, and annihilate Tenochtitlan, and then also take all of its gold and its wealth back with him. And he created a new colony where Tenochtitlan sits now. And now today, Tenochtitlan is modern-day Mexico City, DF. So Cortez is the guy that takes over the Aztec, all right? That is the big thing you need to remember. Cortez takes over the Aztec. That entire story you just heard, you only needed the brick and mortar of it. And then also, if you want, just a little note at the bottom, Cortez took over the Aztecs using natives as allies, right? Now we got another group of people, right? So a cousin of Cortez is this dude. His name is Francisco Pizarro, all right? So Francisco Pizarro is going to decide to go out and take over the people known as the Inca, right? Now, the Inca, that's what you need to do is Pizarro in Peru. You need to put next to Peru, you need to put Inca right here. Inca is spelled I-N-C-A, right? And just like the Aztec, the Inca are a phenomenally advanced civilization, right? An insanely advanced civilization. They are no dummies. They are not stupid. They are a very, very dominant civilization. Now, when they show up in Peru, right, you have to understand the Inca live in the Andes Mountains of Peru, A-N-D-E-S, which I'm sure y'all learned that in geography last year, right? The Andes Mountains are in Peru. They're an extremely high mountain range. Very, very fluctuating climates, but cold throughout parts of the year. And then also the elevation is truly very, very high, as you can see in the background. And this right here is one of their most famous cities. They have two very, very large, very, very intense cities that were built by the Inca. One is known as, Cusco, right? That you know him because he was the character from Emperor's New Groove, right? That is their capital city of Cusco. And this one is their religious and holy site. This place is literally built on top of the Andes Mountains. I cannot wait to go here. It's one of the 10 places I have to go before I die. This is known as Machu Picchu, right? Machu Picchu is their religious capital, okay? So they had temples and things dedicated to their gods and goddesses, and they also had their entire priest social hierarchy structure there, right? Now, some of y'all are saying if they had multiple cities, then how the heck did they how could they get to them if they live in the mountains, right? Well, interesting fact, you might want to jot this down. The Inca had over 10,000 miles of trade networks, roads, and bridges that connected several different highly populated cities throughout the Andes Mountains, right? And also, interesting fact, they did all this without having a written language, right? The Inca had no written language, because they didn't see a use for one, right? Because remember when we talked about the growth of written languages in Mesopotamia and Sumeria and things like that, and how they needed a written language to be able to document farm growth, keep track of different farm products, to know if they were going to be entering into a time of famine, or if they needed to be able to use some of their surpluses and stuff like that. Well, if you really think about it then, do you really need a written language, or do you just need a number system? You can really get by with just a number system, right? And so this is the numbering system that the Inca actually used. They're known as quipus, right? Spelled Q-U-I-P-U, right? And they actually kept track of things that needed to be kept tracked on with these quipus. And we don't know how to decipher them, but we believe the number of knots and the color of the thread are indicative of certain number values, right? So the quipus were how the Inca actually kept track of everything. And also, of course, you know the Incas very well for the domesticated animal, the animal that they used very, very often, known as a llama, right? So the llamas were actually very, very big. They also domesticated guinea pigs as well. They would actually eat those. But the big thing about it is the llamas were used as their beast of burden, right? They helped them carry farm equipment up terraced farms and things like that. Now, the big thing, some of you are probably thinking to yourself, they're like, well, Mr. Terry, you just said earlier they didn't have a lot of large domesticated animals. They only had llamas, and llamas aren't, they couldn't domesticate them in ad nauseum, right? They couldn't domesticate tons of them at once due to the fact that they were on top of mountains and they didn't have grazing land for them to actually domesticate a bunch of them. And also, llamas can only carry 60 pounds of weight. They can't actually carry tons and tons of weight, so you use them whenever you had a chance to use them. More than anything else, they use llamas for their wool to actually make cloth, like clothing and things like that out of, right? So now, interesting though, to keep going forward, this is how the Incas farm. How the heck do you farm in a mountain? You use the system known as terracing, right? Where you literally cut into the mountain and you create flat surfaces to then do your farming in. Now, why am I showing you this? One, because I think it is insanely interesting, right? Because they're using llamas, and they don't have a written language, and they're built in the Andes Mountains. They have over 10,000 miles of trade networks. Also, big thing, why am I bringing this up? A lot of it has to do with the crop that they tended and were the first people to actually domesticate, right? This crop is very important. Jot this down. The potato, right? Europeans had no clue what a potato was until they met the Inca, right? And the Incans showed the Europeans potatoes, and they were like, check these things out. And the Europeans were like, that is the coolest thing I've ever seen. I'm going to make it into chips and French fries and tater tots and all of the like. But excuse me, Mr. Incan farmer, how do you make more of these? All you need to grow another potato is 1 square inch and an eye of a potato, right? I'm actually going to start growing potatoes in my classroom pretty soon and then move them outside eventually, and then I'm going to eat a bunch of them. Now, anyway, but really, really quickly, though, the potatoes are originally from Peru, and the Incans actually showed it to the Spanish conquistadors. Now, when I say showed it to them, it wasn't a very nice show it to them, right? So, because they were actually pretty much taken over. Now, the last facet of the Incan culture that I think is very, very important to talk about is their form of human sacrifice, okay? So there are certain things that you need to remember about these major North American civilizations. 1, they're not dumb. They're highly advanced, right? 2, they are extremely intelligent. 3, they lacked those big domesticated animals and also lacked metal weapons. And 4, they both all pretty much universally practice a system of human sacrifice, right? Now, this right here is an Incan human sacrifice. Now, some of y'all are like, whoa, Mr. Terry, you were talking about cutting people's hearts out and stuff in the Aztec community. I was. Well, the Incas did it differently. They sacrificed children, right? They sacrificed children, particularly below the age of 15, and they preferred to sacrifice children because they believed that they were closer connected to the afterlife, right? Because they were, like, of course, they had just been born. They're, like, not so far removed from it. They also oftentimes would take sacrifices from local villages and stuff, but instead of the Aztec view of taking it as a tax for being taken over by the Aztec, you were considered a great honor to donate your child to be sacrificed. They would then take the children up into the high mountaintops. They would try to get them to kind of be under the influence of a drug or alcohol before they sacrificed them. They would sometimes let them chew coca leaves. Scientists have found coca leaves inside the mouth of some of the sacrifices. And the priest would then either beat the person to death or bludgeon them to death or strangle them to death, right? And then they would perform a process of mummification, right? Where they would remove some of the organs, they would bring it back down, and the sacrifice would be mummified. So this girl's body is actually several hundred years old, and she legit still has her hair and looks like she's just asleep, and she's almost perfectly preserved due to the high altitude of the Andes Mountains, right? And that, of course, is Pizarro, and he's going to be the guy that comes in and takes over the Inca, and this dude, this is the king of the Inca, and his name is King Atahualpa, right? And we'll talk about him here in a second. King Atahualpa. So we had Moctezuma, the leader of the Aztecs. Now we have King Atahualpa, the leader of the Inca, right? Now the Inca were very, very weak at the time. Now some of you are like, well, they already were going to be weak no matter what. The Spanish were going to take over because they had guns and cannons and horses and disease. You're not wrong. But it was an even more opportune time to go take over the Inca at the time, okay? Now, they were being led, of course, by this guy, Francisco Pizarro. Now, the Inca had just got done with a civil war, and they were also being hit very, very hard by a smallpox outbreak, okay? So the civil war was between this guy, Atahualpa, and his brother, okay? And they were claiming that they were the new god king of the Inca because their father died and they both claimed the throne. Well, what ends up happening is after the civil war, the Incan army is going to be even further decimated, but Atahualpa emerges the victor, right? Now, going forward, though, King Atahualpa actually planned to try and overwhelm the Spanish, right? Now, we talked about this in class today when we were talking about, but mathematically, given the fact there are still, even though there's a disease outbreak and even though there's a civil war, the Incas still have thousands of people, while the Spanish only have like a few hundred, right? So the plan was to lure the Spaniards into a very specific place to meet and talk with them, and then when they showed up, they were going to overwhelm them and try to hopefully destroy them and run them out of Peru. Now, really, really quickly, though, let me go ahead and bring this up real fast. The plan was to meet at this city called Cajamarca, right? So do me a favor and put in stars the Battle of Cajamarca, right? And the Battle of, and Cajamarca is spelled Cajamarca. RCA, right? And at the Battle of Cajamarca, okay, the Inca planned to meet the Spanish there to discuss with them and negotiate ways to turn things over without any kind of death or destruction or people having to be killed or whatnot. Let me show you really quick, and this is an important thing to know because this is going to be the premise of a short answer question really fast on your test, okay? So really quick, when we're looking at the Battle of Cajamarca, you got to understand that, oh, that's a chinampa, sorry. Now, you got to understand the plan was to meet at this place known as Cajamarca. And Cajamarca is an Incan city, okay? It's a small Incan city. And this Incan city had a square that it actually entered into, right? So whenever you came into Cajamarca, you actually came in to a square. And there was a road that led into it, and it was surrounded on the outsides by buildings, trees, and vegetation, right? So the plan for the Inca was to tell the Spanish to show up. The Spanish would be here. The Incan would flood in and use their overwhelming numbers to attack and take over the Spanish. And Atahualpa, being elected the new god king of the Inca, decides that he wants to make it a really big show, right? He wants to bring in his entire army. He wants to himself be presented to the Spanish, and then he would snap his fingers and they would go after him, right? But this ends up being a massive backfire because the Spanish are not dumb, right? So under Pizarro's rule, what he does is he takes his small number of Spaniards, only a couple of hundred of them, and he decides to hide them in the buildings and the trees all around the square, right? He hides cannons and guns, and he tells all of his men to carry bells with them and noisemakers. And he's like, you guys are going to hide on the outside of the square. And when they show up and you get the signal, you're going to jump out and freak out, all right? So this sounds like a pretty decent plan, okay? So here comes Atahualpa, right? And to show you really quickly how Atahualpa entered in to the actual Battle of Cajamarca, we got Atahualpa at Cajamarca. All right, so here we go. Now, the big thing about it, you got to understand, when he entered in, there is a picture of Pizarro Atahualpa right here. And Atahualpa actually entered in to the Battle of Cajamarca raised above all of his people, right? He is actually sitting above them. It's a thing called litter, right? And basically his soldiers were carrying a thing like this, and his chair was on top of this tabletop, so he was sitting over top of everybody else, right? Now, what ends up occurring at this battle, though, the plan starts going well for the Spanish. He enters in on this litter. He's got this huge army. But here, let's take a second to kind of take a step back. The Incan are coming in with nothing but stone weapons. One of the biggest ones is this thing known as a trebulus, and it's like literally three rocks tied together with rope, all right? And they have nothing but cloth armor, right? So when they get there and they're showing up and they're trying to show their dominance and stuff like that, they bring Atahualpa into the middle of the square. And coming over from here is a priest, right? And the priest walks up holding a crucifix in one hand and a Bible in the other. And he goes up to Atahualpa and he's yelling at him. And he's like, you must submit to the will of Christ. You must take this Bible, accept it into your heart, and convert to our religion, because all of these are in the name of our God and our leader, Jesus Christ. And then Atahualpa takes the Bible and he looks at it and he thumbs through the pages. And remember, his civilization doesn't have a written language. So he looks at it. He's like, what the heck am I supposed to do with this? And he throws it to the ground because he believes himself to be a God king. And that was the signal, right? The second the Bible hit the ground, the priest throws his hands up, and here come the entire Spanish army, shooting their guns off, not even at the Incan people, right? Shooting their guns off, riding straight into the square, banging their bells together, freaking out. And then what happens is all the Inca start flipping out and trying to run in all different directions. The Inca then the Spanish then brandish their swords, and they then summarily execute somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 Incan people. And guess how many Spanish people died? 0, right? So none. Not a single Spanish soldier was even injured by an Incan warrior because they all ran off, right? Because it was such an extreme moment and they were all scared to death, right? So the Spaniards, after the Battle of Cajamarca, they take Atahualpa as prisoner just like they did to Moctezuma, right? And then what ends up happening is they hold him for ransom, right? So Atahualpa asked his captors, he was like, why are you here? What do you want from us? What do you want? And Pizarro said, oh, we want gold and we want as much as you have. Oh my God. And he got brought into this thing called the Temple of the Sun God, right? And inside this room, a room that looked like this, that had the walls covered in gold, Pizarro said, I want a room this big filled with gold. And the Inca were like, is that all? And then they actually paid the ransom. They paid the ransom for Atahualpa, but then the Spaniards executed him anyway. They actually had him strangled to death. And they forced him to convert to Catholicism. And he converted to Catholicism, and he was actually baptized as Anthony, as his new Christian name, and he actually ends up being strangled to death using this thing called a garrote. And let's just take a second to embrace the fact that how screwed up this is. They take him ransom, they killed his people, they pay the ransom, and they still executed him anyway, right? And then after that, the Spaniards are going to stumble upon an immense fortune of gold and silver. Because remember, the Incan live in the Andes Mountains, right? And where is gold mined from? Silver and gold mines inside of mountain ridges, right? So basically, the Spanish have now gone into a place where they have found more gold than they know what to do with. And the Inca had a lot of it, even more than the Aztec did, right? And so what we're going to do in class, and I know this was a lot of story time and stuff like that, but you know what? It's a great story because the premise of this big battle is going to be like, how does the Battle of Cajamarca serve as an example of the advantages and extreme power of the Spaniards over the natives, even though they were a highly advanced civilization, right? And the things you're going to be able to reference are going to be guns, cannons, horses, and also the aid of disease, right? So now the biggest thing, though, is we will talk about some more stuff tomorrow. We'll talk about setting up colonies and things like that. But I'll see you guys then. Y'all have a good one.